Liar. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's time for yet another show, and I told you earlier in the week that I definitely would not be able to do a live show for Friday. That's now today, Friday, March 25th, 2022. And I told you I wouldn't be able to do it, and I'm not. And so here I am instead with a pre-recorded show for you. And I thought on Tuesday, when I tried to dive into the story of the Moscow apartment bombings of 1999 and the curious rise of Vladimir Putin, I thought that this would be, when I tried diving in and figured out, oh my God, what am I doing? Diving into the story that needs so much more time with 10 minutes to go at the end of the show on Friday, I thought to myself, I says, why not record the entirety of the piece for Friday? Would make a perfect Friday accompaniment. And even if it was all you ever got recorded in time for Friday, it might be a nice follow-up. And everyone would like to hear you read the story, even though by now we got curious and read the story ourselves. And so maybe it would not be one. But on Tuesday, when I recorded this thing, you wouldn't yet have had the chance to do that. So, you're stuck. You got to hear it now. You may recall back on Friday, here's what I hope happened. You recall that back on Tuesday, I brought up this D'Artagnan diary from over at Daily Kos and said this might be a great accompaniment to the story we read about the background of some of the Russian oligarchs and how they became oligarchs. Because oligarchs, whatever, the label doesn't really tell you what's going on. It's almost a nicety. I mean, it does have a negative connotation, certainly, but it doesn't give you the flavor for how they rose to prominence and to power and to great wealth in the same way that, say, calling them mobsters might do. And, it doesn't, being just straight up mobster doesn't capture all, of course, the problem is that it doesn't capture all of the political influence and inside the Russian system, I guess, legitimate political influence among insiders anyway, that these guys tend to have. You say a mobster should have no voice in running the government. But it's part of our continuing investigation into the weird blurring of lines between mobsterism, oligarchy, and legitimate government in Russia that I don't know what, that does a thing that makes our show, interesting to me. And that's really the chief issue here. And so here we go. I'll just start over again with it and read it to you in its entirety. Not that I can definitely get it inside of one or I don't even know, maybe two breaks, but we'll see. So sit down, get something comfortable. Get something comfortable to drink, and I don't know what to make of that. Make yourselves at home. You are probably in all likelihood anyhow. So that was totally superfluous. I'll continue on now. Why don't we just stop the nonsense and begin the reading? The Moscow apartment bombings of 1999 and the curious rise of Vladimir Putin that D'Artagnan wrote up for us at Daily Kos. I'm anxious to see if I, now on full reading, truly understood the way I summarized it at the end of Tuesday's show, because I had just kind of skimmed ahead. And, well, now I'm curious. I had to wait all the way until today, Friday, which is not Friday, it's Tuesday, it was a couple hours. I had to wait. I'd eat lunch, and now I said, now that I've eaten, I'd really like to know how this ends. Well, it began this way, same way as it began on Tuesday. It's disturbing but predictable that as the Ukraine crisis continues to unfold, many Americans are getting what amounts to their first crash course on Russian President Vladimir Putin. One of the many remarkable consequences of the Trump administration was the degree to which the views of the Republican rank-and-file voter were influenced by Trump's solicitous, almost groveling behavior toward Putin, a bizarre non sequitur that must have drawn incredible consternation from those in the U.S. intelligence community and others intimately familiar with Putin's actual history. Two polls in June of last year revealed that Republicans had a higher approval of Putin than President Biden, and we know that was all about owning the libs, with roughly 1 in 5 viewing him favorably in 2017. I mean, not a good record in 2017. But despite what they may think they know, quote unquote know, from our sporadic, reactive, and superficial news media, the reality is that most Americans know next to nothing about Putin. And that's probably true. I mean, for most of us, he just sort of arrived on the scene in a suit and tie, and he, was kind of anointed the successor, but that's always been kind of a mystery from the former Soviet Union into current Russian Federation. Leaders just are sort of handed to us. We have no real clue where they're coming from, unless you're really studying this stuff, whether as a Sovietologist carrying it over into, just Russia studies, or an intelligence person, who's really tracking this stuff closely, which I don't know. He's the president. Why is Lukashenko the president of Belarus? I don't know. Belarusians know, but we don't. Anyway, perhaps if they were aware that credible historians and journalists, if you and I were aware, that credible historians and journalists believe Putin was possibly complicit in the massacre of hundreds of his own citizens in order to facilitate his rise to power, they might be prompted to reevaluate these snapshot perceptions. Even this, I think, doesn't do justice to what's going on. I think we're all open to and, I guess accepting of the possibility, the probability that Putin, killed people along the way. And when we say massacres of his own people, his own citizens, usually we're talking, it wouldn't surprise most of us, even with our limited knowledge of Vladimir Putin, that he had participated in the massacre of some ethnic minority somewhere. But we're talking, remember what the headline is, talking about Muscovites dying in mysterious apartment bombings. This is really, killing your own people kind of thing. I mean, it's terrible when you're killing ethnic minorities, obviously, for obvious reasons, but it's the kind of thing that unfortunately we come to expect from autocratic leaders around the globe. And what we don't really expect to see is them killing their own, members of their own tribe, so to speak. It's just more surprising. Anyway, so where were we with this? Yes, right. Perhaps we would be surprised, or maybe we'll reevaluate. Perhaps not. Either way, it seems like an opportune time for a refresher course on the ascent to power of an individual who has his nuclear missiles on a hair trigger. This is a mobster with nuclear weapons is a different picture, isn't it? All of those weapons, of course, aimed at our homes and families right now. The following is a complex, somewhat Byzantine narrative that contains, as many such narratives do, an equally Byzantine cast of characters and organizations. Probably just as hard to pronounce their names as to figure out who the players are. It is primarily based on unofficial sources, mostly investigative journalists and authors whose access to the evidence is by default secondhand or circumstantial, and its conclusions have been alternatively affirmed and disputed. As noted below, the U.S. government has not confirmed or refuted its conclusions. Despite its recent belligerence, Russia's interests remain critical strategic considerations for the U.S. long into the future. And I am just a little curious about where the conclusions and might have been affirmed or disputed. And what conclusions are we even looking at, right? Is this a report? I don't even know. Now, it confused me a little bit when I read it on Tuesday earlier. Maybe there's an answer forthcoming. Affirmed and disputed are linked here. The, affirmation of these conclusions come from the New York Review of Books, which is mentioned in an upcoming paragraph, if you may recall. Disputed comes from tandfonline.com. I'm just curious about what that is. Taylor and Francis Online, the Journal of Slavic Military Studies. That was some accent I gave to that. Slavic Military Studies. Revisiting Russia's apartment block blasts. An article looks like a sort of a scholarly investigation from January, published in January of 2007, much closer in time. And I wonder whether the conclusions would be the same given the development of further evidence since then. Anyway, we'll begin with D'Artagnan's telling. The leadership of post-Soviet Russia remember this, was a hot mess in the summer of 1999, plagued by credible reports of widespread corruption and accused of stashing his own and his family's ill-gotten money in secret foreign bank accounts. Russia's President, Boris Yeltsin, was taking refuge in the bottle, this time with an unparalleled vengeance. His unity political movement appeared to be careening toward defeat in the upcoming parliamentary and presidential elections, and according to John B. Dunlop, now a senior emeritus fellow at the Hoover Institute and author of The Moscow Bombings of September 1999, Yeltsin was desperately searching for a game changer, something drastic to effect a reversal in his vertiginous fortunes. I should have taken the opportunity to check that pronunciation. He had few cards to play, but eventually settled on one, finding a pretext to force either the cancellation of the elections themselves or creating a national emergency that would suddenly rally the Russian people to his side. Indeed, he had very few cards left, but one of them was the malleability of Russian nationalism, specifically a historical ethnic aversion to and suspicion of the independence-minded Chechen people with whom the Russian Federation had been in a state of war throughout the mid-1990s. The other was a friend with unlimited resources, the Russian oligarch Boris Berezovsky. According to Dunlop, Berezovsky was tasked by Yeltsin to pay enormous ransoms to Chechen separatists who had lately, in their long-standing efforts to establish an independent Chechnya, kidnapped several Russian nationals. That would, of course, put him in a bad light, and having them freed would perhaps rally Russian voters to his side. Might not be enough, but it was something to think about. As predicted, the payments had the desired reverse effect, not of relaxing tensions between Chechnya and Russia, but rather motivating the same separatists to invade neighboring Dagestan in August of 1999, which might also rally Russian people to his side. I don't know. Thus, according to Dunlop, a Kremlin-sponsored national emergency was conceived, a potential incursion by Chechnya, which might justify postponing the looming elections which Yeltsin feared. Yeltsin had no illusions about his own unpopularity, but reasoned that if his own political opponents could be discredited, a hand-picked successor could be maneuvered into office, and Yeltsin, along with his family and associates, would be spared prosecution. As reported by Amy Knight, reviewing Dunlop's analysis for the New York Review of Books, there it is, the plan went very smoothly up to a point, with the Chechen rebels allowed into and out of Dagestan without hindrance. So they're facilitating the invasion at this point, I guess, in order to create that distraction or rallying point for Russian voters. A central player in Yeltsin's schemes and Dunlop's thesis was a former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin. As Knight notes, prior to September of 1999, Putin, then the head of the KGB's renamed successor, the FSB, was still largely unknown to the Russian people. Having demonstrated his loyalty to Yeltsin by removing prosecutors who had pursued corruption investigations against him, Putin was elevated by Yeltsin to the post of prime minister in August of that year. He was chosen to be that friendly successor. So, all right, here's part of the origin story at last. But the Dagestan invasion, and that's in scare quotes, by Chechen separatists failed to galvanize public opinion. Russians apparently didn't particularly care that much about Dagestan, at least not enough to get behind a war involving Russian lives. As Knight observes, and she cites Dunlop's sources here, something more was needed to jolt the public, to get them behind Putin. Something akin to what we would call a 9/11 moment in the United States, for example. And of course, this was pre-9/11, so that wouldn't have made any sense to you then. But, for example, as we said, in order for the family's operation successor to succeed, something would have to occur to boost Putin's public image and demonstrate his capacity for strong leadership. I should pause here for a second to say, in order for the family's operation successor to succeed. And family is capitalized here. And I'm not certain exactly why or what we're talking about here, but let's continue on. So something else has to occur to boost Putin's image sufficiently here to demonstrate his capacity for strong leadership. As Dunlop's sources said, more violence was needed to justify a war against Chechnya, which would unite people around the new prime minister. As David Satter, former senior fellow for the Hudson Institute, another one, wrote in 2016, what followed in September of 1999 was a series of 4 apartment complex bombings in Moscow. Some other cities I'm going to have to learn to pronounce. What is this? Bunyaksk. Oh my goodness. Buynaksk. And Volgodonsk. That's slightly easier to pronounce. I hope I got something close to right here. Well, 4 apartment complex bombings in these 3 cities. It killed 300 Russian citizens and wounded hundreds more. According to Dunlop's research, as summarized by Knight, multiple sources point to the FSB's prior knowledge of the coming attacks, including statements made by Russian Duma members made before the attacks themselves, based on information provided by Russian military intelligence, or the GRU. So, if the FSB, then led by Putin protege and longtime trusted friend Nikolai Patrushev, knew about the attacks ahead of time, well, then there's little question that Vladimir Putin did. Now, whether or not the evidence bears out, I can't tell you, but this is the thesis here. But the available evidence, according to multiple investigators and journalists who have reviewed the records and testimony available, suggests an even more sinister conclusion. And, it's hard to be more sinister than that. Although I was going to say, I suppose there's some possibility that, like you get terrorist chatter. We didn't know about terrorist chatter, I don't think, before 9/11. Then we found out after 9/11 that we did know about terrorist chatter before 9/11. It's just you and I didn't know about terrorist chatter because we never heard the term before. But the intelligence community had heard about terrorist chatter and was was tracking it the best they could, which, in that event was to no avail. But, the concept that before the attack takes place, sometimes intelligence services pick up inklings that an attack is going to happen. Whether they have enough evidence to know with certainty what kind of attack and where so that they can stop it is another story. But I suppose it's possible that we could be talking about, or they could at least offer the excuse of, we picked up on Chechnyan terrorist chatter ahead of time, but not enough to lead us to a place where we could head off the attacks, right? Okay. So, at any rate, the evidence apparently also suggests, as they say, even more sinister conclusion. As Satter writes, I believe that Vladimir Putin came to power as the result of an act of terror committed against his own people. The evidence is overwhelming that the apartment house bombings in 1999 in Moscow, and different spelling of this city, see if that helps me pronounce it. Buynaksk, still not so great. Buynaksk. Buynaksk. Oof, boy. And Volgodonsk, which, anyway, these bombings provided a pretext for the Second Chechen War. I don't think I even had separated into 2 different Chechen wars in my mind, but okay. And catapulted Putin into the presidency. All these, it is claimed here, carried out by the Russian Federal Security Police or Service, or FSB. The evidence for that assertion, we continue with D'Artagnan here, is persuasive. Okay, especially bolstered by an event that occurred 2 weeks later on September 22nd, 1999, in the city of Ryazan, Ryazan, southeast of Moscow. Residents of an apartment complex observed several individuals in a white Zhiguli sedan bearing partially obscured license plates. I suppose that's the locally produced brand, Zhiguli, Zhiguli, bearing partially obscured license plates, removing what appeared to be 3 110-pound sacks of material. How they got the measurement, I don't know. And carrying them into the complex's basement. The local FSB and regular police found explosive materials and detonators in the sacks, including traces of the chemical RDX, or hexogen. This was the same material found in the other apartment bombs. Tightly regulated in Russia, the only source of hexogen was through secure Russian governmental sources. But there was another, more obvious clue. The license plate on the vehicle used by those removing these materials turned out to be traced, through vigilant local law enforcement efforts, back to the FSB. And when the local police apprehended the men that same evening through standard police vehicle checks, it turned out that they were FSB employees. Apparently, the KGB's successor organization had been caught red-handed planting another bomb. As Knight reports, the FSB immediately went into denial mode. I suppose I would too. Here's the denial mode, as Knight describes it. After a day and a half of silence, Patrushev announced on television that the apparent bomb had been part of a training exercise. Very different. And that the sacks contained only sugar, which I think probably would have been much sought after. But okay, 110-pound sacks of sugar. Whatever. The local Ryazan FSB and regular police, who had been combing the city for more explosives, expressed outrage. In the words of one police official, "Our preliminary tests showed the presence of explosives. As far as we were concerned, the danger was real." Okay, and it wasn't just sugar? Okay. The FSB then magnified its apparent indiscretion by publicly reframing it as a training exercise, but Russia's interior minister, who would have known of any training exercise, had already publicly referred to the Ryazan bombing attempt as a thwarted terrorist attack. Accordingly, Dunlop and others reasonably conclude, as Knight puts it, that the materials discovered in Ryazan were the makings of a real bomb, and the FSB was caught in the act. Meanwhile, the FSB loudly and publicly blaming the bombings on international terrorists dug into Chechnya. 2 Arab mercenaries were identified as its, quote, masterminds, but both were ultimately, and perhaps conveniently, killed in Chechnya. After Yeltsin resigned on December 31st, 1999, Putin became acting president. Oh, look, we can actually give him the sound effect for that. Vladimir Putin, acting president of the Russian Federation. I guess, does he assume office before midnight so that he's still in 1999? Or does it begin in January 1st, 2000? Anyway, he was formally elected in March of 2000, riding a wave of anti-Chechen sentiment. This now begins to ring a bell, that he helped to stoke after these bombings. As Knight notes, it was a remarkably serendipitous election for Putin. Now, before I go on with Knight's comments about this, I now begin to, I'm having recollections now of how it was that not so many years after these incidents, the Russians appeared to be willing to cooperate with the United States in the global war on terror, as we were calling it, and how I, rationalized it at the time by saying, well, yeah, they want in on it because it's an excuse for them to continue fighting against their Chechen rebels, whom they describe as Muslim terrorists and extremists, and employing, Arab mercenaries in their attack schemes. And that this was perfect cover for them to continue this war, which would otherwise be viewed very unfavorably around the world. But in the context or under the cover of the American-led global war on terror, they would have some semblance of an excuse to continue their campaign. Anyway, as Knight notes, it was a remarkably serendipitous election for Putin in March of 2000. As it turned out, there was no need to cancel the elections because the Russian people rallied around Putin and his vows to seek revenge against ethnic Chechens. Russian troops began invading Chechnya on October 1st. His approval rating soared from 31% in mid-August to 78% in November. As Dunlop notes, the continuing upward movement in Putin's rating was accompanied by an increase in the hatred, which soon became incandescent on the part of ethnic Russians for Chechens. And that would certainly explain why this is a favored technique now in the invasion of Ukraine. As Satter testified before the House Committee on Foreign Affairs in 2017, the newly elected President Putin's first act was to guarantee Yeltsin immunity from prosecution. Meanwhile, Putin began to gin up public opinion against the Chechens. As reported by Radio Free Europe / Radio Liberty in 2019, on September 23rd, Putin asserted terrorists in Chechnya were to blame and ordered a massive air campaign. Would anyone like a massive air campaign? I'll offer it to you. Ordered a massive air campaign within the northern Caucasus region. When asked a day later about the campaign targeting what he called terrorists, Putin responded with the phrase that inaugurated his rise to preeminence. "We will pursue them everywhere," he said, using a crude slang expression. "Excuse me for saying so. We'll catch them in the toilet. We'll wipe them out in the outhouse." The statement became a Putin catchphrase. And set the tone for the 20 years of rule that followed. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, the same guy who was just talking to you a second ago. Our Patreon subscription drive is still going strong, with over 175 monthly donors who help keep us on the air. If we've helped keep you going during the pandemic, why not return the favor and help us keep going so we can all be together for the next disaster? Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it easy to make secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for keeping you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We literally could not do this without you. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netflix Radio. We continue with our reading of the diary from D'Artagnan over at Daily Kos on the Moscow apartment bombings in 1999 and how they, it is supposed, may have contributed to the rise to power of Vladimir Putin, finally explaining for many of us here in the West exactly how we ended up with this guy. So, just before the break, we were reading the report from 2019 from Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty that on September 23rd of 2000, Putin had asserted the terrorists in Chechnya were to blame for these apartment bombings and made the same mistake, ordered a massive air campaign in retaliation, and that seemed to succeed in rallying the Russian population behind him there. So now we continue with D'Artagnan's write-up. Multiple arrests of individuals purportedly involved in the bombings took place in the ensuing months. Trials, and those of course in scare quotes, trials were held for each separate bombing, but as Knight observes, the trials of those accused of taking part in the Moscow and Volgodonsk plots were closed, so the evidence against the alleged terrorists was never made public. The other trial was public, but Knight notes, citing Dunlop's investigation, that the confessions of the alleged perpetrators may have been coerced through torture. Attempts by independent journalists and vying Russian political parties to investigate the true nature of these bombings met with stiff resistance by the now Putin-dominated Unity Party. Berezovsky himself, the oligarch, funded an effort by former SFB officer Alexander Litvinenko to investigate the bombings. A book titled Blowing Up Russia was the outcome. It was published 1 year after Litvinenko died from radioactive poisoning. How odd. As Satter observes, Litvinenko was one of several Russian journalists who attempted to investigate the matter, only to end up mysteriously murdered. An excerpt here reads, Russian human rights defenders Sergei Yushchenkov, Yuri Shchekochinkin, maybe, Anna, this is impossible, Anna Politkovskaya and Alexander Litvinenko also worked to shed light on the apartment bombings, but all of them were murdered between 2003 and 2006. All of them also had difficult to pronounce names, or at least difficult to pronounce on the fly. I'm sure if I had a pronunciation guide ahead of time, it would have been a smart thing to do for this piece. I would have sounded just great on that, and then we would be able to talk about them more easily because we wouldn't be hesitant to mention their names. Satter himself requested, via the Freedom of Information Act, information from the U.S. government, including the CIA, good luck there, regarding their knowledge about the bombings. In an article written for the National Review in 2017, he described the response he received. And before I even read it here, I got a note, I guess, at some point for the record here. For those who might be skeptics, I can agree, I understand. All of our sources here, besides the New York Times review of books, appear originally to come from commentators who would have a rather more conservative bent than the rest of us. Hoover, was it? The Hoover Institute. And here a piece from the National Review as well. Not our go-to sources here, necessarily. But, now these days, of course, who can tell what we're supposed to expect from old-line conservatives in their analysis of Putin and his rise to power? There's reason to believe that some old-line conservatives would maintain the old-line conservative line on any leader of Russia and be skeptical of them as a thug and a KGB operative. And of course now, post-Trump, Republican and conservative political actors can't necessarily be, trusted to maintain a healthy or any skepticism at all about Russian actors. But here, I guess we are seeing that skepticism and that easy belief that they would resort to thuggery to rise to power. And, that happens to coincide with how we feel about Putin at the moment and have felt about him during the Trump years as well, and even before when it was Barack Obama in office. I don't think that there was a great deal of liberal interest in befriending Putin, though we were certainly, I think, probably led at certain points to believe, maybe he doesn't consider the Russian Federation an enemy of the United States in the same way that the Soviet Union did, but it quickly became clear that, he was pining for those days all along. Anyway, point is, ordinarily we wouldn't be pointing to Hoover and NR, not National Review Online, but the National Review as helpful and trustworthy sources for anything, but we are here for whatever reason, but taking it with a grain of salt. So where were we? We were reading Satter's piece for National Review in 2017 describing the response he received in seeking what information our own intelligence community had about the bombings. The response from the CIA was unhelpful. No surprise there. Mary E. Wilson, an acting information review officer. I don't feel like going back and getting the sound effect for that one. Oh, all right. I've talked myself into it. Ah, damn it. I'm too obsessive about these things. Mary E. Wilson and
Acting!
Yes, information review officer said that the CIA could not even acknowledge the existence of records on the 1999 Russian apartment bombings or the purported training exercise in Ryazan. To do so would reveal activities, sources, or methods, as well as very specific aspects of the agency's intelligence interest or lack thereof in the Russian bombings. That's confusing, but not unexpected. For his part, Putin continues to deny that the FSB was ever involved in planning the bombings at all. As Knight notes, however, assuming the FSB was involved, it is inconceivable that it would have been done without the sanction of Putin. The relationship between the Prime Minister in 1999 and his protege at FSB was well established. As Knight observes, Yeltsin wrote in his memoirs, Midnight Diaries, that after Putin was appointed Prime Minister in August of 1999, Putin turned to me and requested absolute power to coordinate all power structures. I would not give that to him. But okay. This, of course, would have included the FSB. Furthermore, FSB Chief Patrushev was a very trusted longtime ally of Putin's from St. Petersburg. Their ties dated back to 1975, when both joined the KGB in what was then Leningrad and worked together in the counterintelligence department. When Putin took over the FSB in July of 1998, Patrushev served as his deputy. I'm still not sure whether it's Patrushev or Patrushev, but maybe we can check that out at some point. Anyway, when he served as his deputy, assuming Putin's post after Putin became prime minister. Asked in an interview for First Person who he especially trusted, Putin named, among a few others, Patrushev. As veteran journalist / war correspondent Scott Anderson, not our Scott Anderson, but Scott Anderson nonetheless, in his comprehensive 2017 reporting on the bombings for GQ, observed, one of the singular aspects of the story is how reticent Western nations are to provide their own intelligence findings about it. I think it's not our Scott Anderson. Scott, have you been doing this stuff? Maybe we don't know about all of this reporting for GQ in your background. Could be true. Why don't we claim it is true? And then we all feel like, close to someone famous here. All right. Well, at any rate, as this Scott Anderson, whether it's ours or not, observed, one of the singular aspects of the story is how reticent Western nations are to provide their own intelligence findings about it, these bombings. From the perspective of continued engagement with Russia, that position makes some degree of realpolitik sense. Such an accusation, backed up with credible evidence, risks permanently imperiling ongoing and future relationships to the Russian Federation. Still, sticky questions left unattended for geopolitical reasons tend to be resolved one way or another, given the passage of time. Before I go on to the next quote, I guess this is one of those moments where you might want to resolve them in one way, given the passage of time. Now might be an opportunity. Anderson writes, it is a riddle that lies at the very heart of the modern Russian state, one that remains unsolved to this day. In the awful events of September of 1999, did Russia find its avenging angel in Vladimir Putin, the proverbial man of action, who crushed his nation's attackers and led his people out of a time of crisis? Or was that crisis actually manufactured to benefit Putin, a scheme by Russia's secret police to bring one of their own to power? What makes this question important, and I think now we can see exactly how important it is, but back then, what makes this question important is that absent the bombings of September 1999 and all that transpired as a result, it is hard to conceive of any scenario whereby Putin would hold the position he enjoys today. A player on the global stage, a ruler of one of the most powerful nations on earth, period. And now, of course, the invader of Ukraine. And a worldwide oligarch holding billions of dollars in personal assets so far beyond everyone's reach, and commanding an army of oligarchs with resources beyond imagination, and with nuclear weapons on top, and with the, flag and national anthem and business suits and nuclear weapons and armed forces of a real live nation with actual veto power at the UN Security Council, as a matter of fact. The only mobster with a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council in history, I think, unless we've been deceived about the origins of some of our other power brokers. But that's pretty amazing. When you talk about mob muscle, and it involves, I don't even know how many enlisted men and women in the armed forces, plus nuclear weapons, plus geopolitical status, plus oil reserves, plus UN Security Council seat, and everything else. How many mobsters have had their teams banned from the Olympics in the past, I ask you? All right, time now for the exciting conclusion, which is to say one last paragraph wherein D'Artagnan chimes in. With Russia now seemingly bent on the total subjugation of Ukraine, and with all Western strategic interests suddenly thrust into a critical crossroads, it still appears that only time will determine whether the U.S. intelligence community sees fit to open up its files. It might be time for another set of FOIA requests. Scott, you might want to get on that and get us the real information. Given that not only as a ruler, ostensibly, of Russia, sitting up there as a mobster and having all of these strategic geopolitical assets at your command, but I add to it the possibility that you are able to influence and possibly even control at one point, and maybe again in the future, the elections in the United States of America. Or, even just get, enough geopolitical control that you might be able to talk a still independent, if that was the case, Republican president, assuming there's another one later on, into supporting Russia's positions on things. I mean, it was bad enough when we thought that there was a possibility that Putin would be able to walk into Ukraine and keep it because the United States, even as an independent entity, was willing to throw its weight behind Russia at the UN or elsewhere, whatever international fora became necessary to give the invasion the American agreement, the American imprimatur. Who then challenges it at that point? I mean, it's certainly possible that the European Union could have done so and may still do so even without American participation. I mean, they've really, come into their own as a power center, and it would be in their interest, I think, to assert themselves even against a united front of Russia and the U.S. But that, too, would be, I think, in Putin's interest, opening up a gap between the EU and the United States, and that would contribute to the breakup of that alliance, of NATO as an alliance, as Europeans continue to rebuild their own defenses and align along their own European, Eurocentric lines, rather than becoming, or remaining, I guess, dependent on NATO for its military strategy. That would, either way, it would work pretty well. But imagine if you were also able to just completely subsume the United States and its political interests to Russian political interests. Certainly, clearly the most powerful mobster in the world, even over and above, if you wanted to consider the absolute monarchical rulers of Middle Eastern states like Saudi Arabia, who personally own the entirety of their country, as mobsters. And, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, I suppose, makes it a little bit easier to think of them that way. We've always, seen them as something other than a traditional Western concept of a nation state, even though they've adopted all of those trappings. But, we've been over this ground with Russia and Saudi Arabia, Saudi-ish Arabia, a number of times. But This puts it in a slightly different light. Opens up a lot of different angles on how to consider the Russia of today. Very interesting. Thanks, D'Artagnan, for bringing this to our attention and scaring the living crap out of us. On a Friday, no less. That's a Tuesday. How do you like that? Friday seems like a good time to circle back on something like this because, of course, you might find yourself over the weekend having a conversation having to do with this, and because it's not immediately in the hot news of the day, but something that we mentioned the other day and never circled back and went back to. We read about how James O'Keefe got himself wrapped up in the Ashley Biden diary story, and I mentioned to you at that point that there was a good look back at the Hunter Biden laptop story and why it didn't work out the way Republicans thought that they wanted it to, or thought that it would. And I did eventually find the tweet I was looking for from somebody who said, I went down the rabbit hole on this thing, but it wasn't about the laptop. It was about the question generally about Hunter Biden and his relations with Burisma, the oil company in Ukraine. But I did find this other story that I had also put away about the laptop specifically from Philip Bump in the Washington Post, which I thought was a good and thorough explanation of why this story never worked and what it was that people very recently thought should be revived about the story and could be redeemed about the story, and why that too didn't work. In a piece he calls The Forgotten and Ignored Context for the Emergence of the Hunter Biden Laptop Story. This was back on March 18th. Let me present it to you now. When the New York Post reported on October 14th, 2020, that it was in possession of emails between a Ukrainian businessman and Hunter Biden, son of the then Democratic presidential nominee, it would have been hard to predict what followed. This was less than 3 weeks before the election itself, and the content of the report was soon subsumed to the odd way in which the paper obtained the information. This was information that the other reporter, who I mentioned before, tweeting about having gone down the rabbit hole, that was the rabbit hole he went down. This other rabbit hole presented itself soon after because of the odd way in which the paper obtained the information, as Bump puts it. Mainstream outlets and social media companies balked at elevating the story's claims, triggering frustrations. That's funny. Frustrations on the right that remain to this day. New reporting has re-elevated questions about how the story emerged and was handled. In light of that resurrection, it seems useful to articulate exactly why there was suspicion about the story's origins, suspicion that itself has not entirely been resolved. There are at least 4 questions that arose from the initial report. Those are: how did the information published by the New York Post purportedly get from Hunter Biden to the paper? Was that information legitimate? Was the media's skepticism about the chain of custody and the information warranted? And was the social media blackout of the Post's story warranted? In this article, we'll only look at the overlap of the first and third questions. Was the sourcing for information sufficiently dubious to justify caution by mainstream outlets? The answer, it seems clear, is yes. You'll remember the story. I know you will too. Hunter Biden allegedly showed up at a computer repair shop with 3 water-damaged laptop computers. According to John Paul McIsaac, the proprietor of that shop, one of the 3 computers was beyond repair, one simply needed an external keyboard, and one required data recovery. McIsaac recovered the data, but no one ever came to pick the machine up. Eventually, the data from the computer made its way to Rudy Giuliani, Donald Trump's personal attorney. It was Giuliani that gave it to the Post. Now, that summary excludes a lot of detail. Like, okay, why did you even look at what the data was, for one thing? Some of that detail was known at the time that the New York Post story broke. Some of that detail only emerged afterward. Here, in the form of a timeline, is detail that seems salient to our current consideration of how the Post got the material from the laptop, as well as what was known at the time. Going back now to the 2016 election, it's critical to remember what happened in the 2016 election cycle. Then WikiLeaks published 2 large clusters of documents stolen by Russian hackers from the Democratic National Committee's networks and from John Podesta, a top aide to the Democratic nominee, Hillary Clinton. The Podesta material, in particular, was released in tranches for days beginning October 7th, 2016. It was real information, understood even then to have been a product of Russian efforts that became fodder for criticism of Clinton. After the election, we learned the full scope of Russia's involvement in the election. Suddenly, the coverage of the WikiLeaks material took on a new light. It was stolen by a foreign government to try to influence U.S. politics. Media companies reconsidered their coverage. Should there have been more caution about playing into the hands of a foreign influence campaign? This question was very much on people's minds in the months before the 2020 election, particularly given indications that Russia was again hoping to aid Trump's election. The 2019 impeachment is next in our timeline. The other overlapping factor coloring the release of the Post story was the investigation into Trump's efforts to leverage Ukrainian aid to damage Biden the previous year. Giuliani was central to that effort as well, I would add. In late 2018, he began exploring the idea that Biden, as vice president several years before, had improperly tried to influence Ukraine to block an investigation of Burisma, a company for which Hunter Biden served as a board member. This story, promoted by an investigator targeted for termination by the U.S. government, was later debunked, but it seemed a promising line of attack. On April 1st, 2019, curiously enough, a writer linked to Giuliani named John Solomon, the guy who was at The Hill, right, I think, for so many years, wrote the first of several stories about the allegations. On April 12th, the laptops were dropped off at McIsaac's repair shop. McIsaac, you'll recall, is legally blind and was not able to identify Hunter Biden by sight. One of the laptops, though, bore a sticker for the Beau Biden Foundation, an organization dedicated to Hunter's late brother. Not a sticker that a whole lot of people probably have, but one I would put on a laptop if I wanted people to think it was Hunter Biden's, I guess. At some point in the middle of this month, Hunter Biden left Burisma's board. Presumably, he was by that point aware that questions were being asked about his role. If not, it became very clear on May 1st when the Times elevated the Burisma question in its coverage. In the meantime, Vladimir Zelensky had been elected president of Ukraine, and efforts to pressure him to announce an investigation into Biden began. In early May of 2019, Giuliani planned a trip to Ukraine to dig up information that might damage Biden, a plan that was covered in the press. After broad outcry, he scrapped the trip, but the signal was sent. Giuliani was seeking information deleterious to Biden. Later that month, someone in Kyiv was approached about buying Hunter Biden's emails. This was not reported until October 21st, 2020, a week after the Post's story about the laptop. The 2 people who said they were approached with Hunter Biden's alleged emails last year did not know whether any of them were real, and they declined to identify who was behind the offers. Times' Simon Schuster wrote. The 2 people said they could not confirm whether any of the material presented to them was the same as that which had been recently published in the U.S. At least one, though, said the material in the Post was familiar looking. It's not clear what this was or what the source was. It could have been from Biden's business partners in Ukraine. It could have been from a hack of Biden's account. His primary email address was an Apple iCloud account, meaning that emails and photos probably sat online where hackers might be able to access them. In mid-September of 2019, the other person who spoke with Schuster was offered similar material. When the Post first reported on its possession of material from Hunter Biden's laptop, it shared a PDF of an email included in that material. That PDF carried metadata indicating that it was created on October 10th, 2019, meaning that either it was created on a machine that had the wrong date set, or that it was created after the laptop came into McIsaac's possession. That does seem a little bit weird, don't you think? That's a little odd, and therefore I think worthy of some skepticism, to say the least. Now, it's possible that McIsaac himself created the PDF. That's certainly possible, right? As the beginning of the impeachment investigation into Trump for his interactions with Ukraine had begun the previous month, and he may want to take a swipe at him for that reason. All right. Let's see. Wall Street Journal reporter Michael Bender reported in his book, Frankly, We Did Win This Election, that McIsaac, hearing Hunter Biden come up as part of the impeachment investigation, asked his father for advice, McIsaac's father, for advice on the laptop. Eventually, a connection was made to the FBI, and on December 9th, the FBI appeared with a subpoena for the laptop and for a hard drive. It's not clear what was on that hard drive, though it may have been a backup made by McIsaac. All right, we'll take a 1-minute break in the reading of all of this, and just to give ourselves a chance to catch our breath. But you see, we're up to speed on what was happening, and a reminder of just how weird the McIsaac story is. I can't tell you if Hunter Biden was the one that dropped off the laptop because I'm blind. Okay, and I can't tell you why the PDF was dated after I got the laptop because reasons? I don't know. Well, we'll see. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's continue reading Philip Bump's recap of the issues surrounding the Hunter Biden laptop story and the revival of that story. Reminder, again, that the PDF that the New York Post produced to show, hey, here's the emails that we got off of Hunter Biden's laptop, was from a PDF indicating that it was created on October 10th, 2019. Either it was created on a machine that had the date wrong, or that the PDF was created after the laptop came into McIsaac's possession. And one wonders why a PDF of the email would have been created at that point. Although I suppose, as he says, it's possible that McIsaac himself created the PDF as the beginning of the impeachment investigation into Trump had begun the previous month, and he began to learn from various Republican dirt digging who Hunter Biden was and what he might have on his hands, although he shouldn't have been looking through the emails. But I guess it's possible that he says, I need to show people what I've got. And if the New York Post is the outlet that'll take the stuff, they're going to want to see what sort of material you have. I create a PDF, I send it to them, and it all snowballs from there. Yes, we like this. We'd be interested in picking this up. Or it's not really on the disk and not really part of his email chain at all. It's just something McIsaac made up from out of thin air. We don't know, but it's one of the problems with the chain of custody here. So where were we? Yes, okay. So Michael Bender from the Wall Street Journal reported in his book, entitled, Frankly, We Did Win This Election, that McIsaac, hearing Hunter Biden come up as part of the impeachment investigation, asked his dad for advice on the laptop. A connection is made to the FBI, and on December 9th, the FBI appears with a subpoena for the laptop and for a hard drive. It's not clear what was on the hard drive, though it may have been a backup made by McIsaac. At the time, incidentally, Giuliani was in Ukraine looking to dig up dirt disparaging Joe Biden. That included meeting with a member of the Ukrainian parliament who was later sanctioned by the Treasury Department as a Russian agent. In spring 2020, Joe Biden secured the Democratic presidential nomination. At some point, Giuliani then comes into possession of the material from the laptop. The Daily Mail, for what it's worth, reported in December of 2020 that the material was turned over to Giuliani's lawyer no later than May of that year. According to Bender's conversation with the lawyer, Robert Costello, that didn't happen until August, purely by chance. In August 2020, on a whim, as Costello described it to me, this is a quote from the book, he asked Giuliani's assistant, is that Christiane Allen? I don't know. He asked Giuliani's assistant to keep an eye out for any strange political tips coming into the email boxes for Giuliani's various companies. Costello had a couple of dozen emails within a few days, including one from J.P. McIsaac, Bender wrote. We do know that by September of 2020, Steve Bannon to you and me, and Stephen KGB Bannon to Scott, another ally of Trump's, as they put it, was bragging about having it. This laptop or the emails, I'm not sure which. Oh, the email from J.P. McIsaac? I don't know. On September 28th, he gave an interview with a Dutch television network hyping his possession of the laptop. Oh, okay, that he's got the actual laptop. Wow. I don't think I even remember it that way. But here it is, the embedded tweet with the video in it, in which he's bragging on it. And this is, September 28th, still a couple weeks or a couple days before that PDF ever gets created for some reason. There were already strange rumblings about Hunter Biden at the time. Earlier that same month, someone was passing around a lengthy dossier of allegations about Hunter Biden's business dealings with China, created by a non-existent entity. That document was shared, among others, by an employee of the Chinese billionaire Guo Wenyi. You know we've heard his name before. Guo is also the owner of the boat on which Bannon had been arrested for fraud in August of 2020. After the Post report on Hunter Biden's laptop, the Daily Beast uncovered claims promoted by outlets linked to Guo focused on a Hunter Biden laptop. 3 hard disk drives of videos and dossiers of Hunter Biden's connections with the Chinese Communist Party have been sent to Nancy Pelosi and DOJ. One tweet read, "Big money and sex scandal." That was published September 28th, the same day as Bannon's interview with Dutch TV. Similar allegations had been made days before. The first time the Post saw the material was on October 4th. By October 11th, Giuliani had handed over the entire duplicated contents of the hard drive, and the newspaper began debating how to handle it. The Times would later report that this was contentious even at the conservative publication. That is the New York Post. Fox News had already passed on it, apparently in part because of the questions about provenance. A number of Post employees questioned whether the paper had done enough to vet the material. Speaking to the Times, Giuliani insisted that this was exactly why the Post was given all of it. Either nobody else would take it, he said, or if they took it, they would spend all the time they could to try to contradict it before they put it out. After the story came out, the Post didn't share the material with other outlets for them to do their own investigations. In other words, coverage necessarily depended on taking the Post's word for things, which is by itself a disincentive for other outlets. After the story published October 14th, media outlets tried to assess its credibility without luck. McIsaac gave a lengthy, odd interview to reporters that same afternoon in which he repeatedly gave evasive answers and appeared to change his explanations for how he knew whose laptop it was and how it got to the FBI. In the days that followed, the Time and Daily Beast reports reinforced questions about how the material was obtained and how it was being used explicitly to aid Trump's campaign. Even today, the full story isn't clear. is the story straightforward? McIsaac obtained the laptop, thought it might be relevant to national politics, and then found only one taker, Giuliani, for the material? Was the material reportedly circulating in Ukraine the same stuff? Non-existent? Obtained from an iCloud hack independently? Did Guo learn about the laptop from Bannon, with mentions of the material in September following from there? It is, of course, always easy to ask infinite questions when you're skeptical, but that the answers to this aren't known now reinforces the reasons for skepticism 18 months ago. They haven't made any progress on this at all. The reticence to aid possible Russian interference probably had one unintended effect. It made the contents of the drive itself, as reported by the Post, seem more important than it would likely have been considered otherwise. But that is the subject for a different article. Whether we'll ever get that article from Phil Bump, anyway, is an open question. Let's see, though, if I can find the other short tweet thread about what it was like going down the Burisma rabbit hole and read that side by side. And here it is. Hey, I found it. What do you know? It is a thread from Adam Davidson, formerly of the New Yorker and This American Life as well. And he is speaking again about the Burisma story and what he found in trying to look into it. A thread that, he began on March 19th, just as some reporters were attempting to bring the story back up. It reminds me a little bit of the way reporters kept trying to justify their suspicions about the lab leak theory of COVID-19 and then go back and prove, at least, even though they were wrong, that they weren't crazy to have been wrong, but then maybe try and shoehorn the story back into the news again anyway and actually make an attempt at showing that it was right, even though it never really worked out and just kept failing. Similar thing here, I think. Adam writing, in 2018, I went pretty deep into the Burisma hole. No comment on whatever that might sound like to you. I felt that since I was reporting so much on Trump's international corruption, I should give a serious look into Hunter Biden. But the story just wasn't there. Okay. We see later that it's interesting, he's actually embedded Marcy Wheeler's tweet about the Philip Bump article. That's, I think, why I connected these two things in my head, saying it was pretty good, but that if you're going to call out John Solomon, you also should call out Ken Vogel from the New York Times. And I guess this moves Adam to say, let me explain myself in terms of what I was thinking about trying to dig into the Burisma story. And he goes on and says, it's definitely lame that the children of politicians can get lucrative gigs off of their last names. I wish that didn't happen. But it was absurd to compare Hunter and Burisma to any one of the Trump deals I covered. That was sort of an interesting jumping off point in its own right, but let's continue on with the thread. Now, I think I and my editors would have written as much as we could if we found that Hunter Biden did something illegal or just bad or something like that, but we didn't. So we used our news judgment to not write about this nothing issue. To be clear, I hate the way politicians use their positions to make money. I think it's really bad that Obama and Clinton, both sides, that Obama and Clinton became wildly rich after leaving office, and I really hate the nepotistic aspect. But there is no comparison to the Trump organization. I don't care what the Manhattan DA says. The Trump organization's core business model since 2009, I'm liking this part, has been working closely with money laundering oligarchs to facilitate their money laundering. There is zero comparison between that activity, which actively undermines the U.S. and hurts the victims of corruption in other countries. On a scale of 1 to 100, Hunter Biden is, I don't know, 20. It's pretty lame to get sweetheart deals on your dad's name, but also very, very common. The Trump Organization is a profound outlier among U.S. companies. I'd say a 95 on that 1 to 100 scale. They knowingly participated in and helped a money laundering operation that was almost certainly for, among others, Iran's National Guard WMD efforts, the Revolutionary Guard, right? Isn't that what they call them there? All right. I'm bumping that up 95, bumping up that 95 to a full 100. Hunter Biden's laptop has gotten roughly, infinitely more coverage than Trump's actual work for an actual enemy power of the U.S. What the effing F? And that's actually the whole thread. It goes in a different direction than I originally thought, but an interesting one all by itself. And as I said, it was an interesting jumping off point for some other things. The ideas of getting sweetheart deals off of your dad's name being pretty lame. Yeah, that's true, and it happened. That does happen on both sides. But I'm also sort of thinking, well, not only is there no comparison, but there's a function of this that we absolutely love in the United States and is like a cornerstone of our national character, that property ought to be able to be handed down from parents to children. And the biggest, the sweetest sweetheart deal there is in America or anywhere is to inherit wealth. And, if you've ever even gotten just a small amount of money, you probably are thinking, well, I'm pretty grateful for the fact that this could happen. If you've gotten huge sums and you're now independently wealthy because your parents, grandparents, whatever, were independently wealthy and the whole family is still independently wealthy, well, then I'm sure you do love it to death. I'm sure it's awesome. Even getting a small amount of money can be very helpful. And, you say, well, I don't know, I feel entitled to this in some way. But, it is a question, like, do we have to do this? Is there really a reason, a policy reason that's, beyond, well, people won't work hard if they don't feel like they can pass everything on to their kids? Well, they probably work hard regardless so that they can live a good lifestyle while they're alive. And they don't have to be able to pass everything in order to have continued incentive to continue to work hard, et cetera, et cetera. It just seems like we sort of pass by that one. Like, that's not, nepotism per se, but it, as though it was not a lame thing to inherit wealth because your dad had it. I mean, I don't know why we exempt that. And we love that in this country. It's a cornerstone of our foundation. Property rights, we call it. But, why is it that you're rich because your dad worked hard? That actually doesn't make a great deal of sense, but, we can make some allowances for some of it. But in the meantime, instead, we focus instead on, well, why should you be able to sign a deal with Burisma because your dad has political influence or something like that? Why should you be able to start your own company because you inherited millions of dollars and it doesn't make a damn bit of difference to you whether you lose some number of millions of those dollars by starting a company that nobody gives a goddamn about and doesn't produce anything that's worth anything to anybody? But you decided to start it anyway. What's the point of any of that stuff? Where I went to, because I went to Harvard or Yale because my dad was extraordinarily rich. I did not. But let's say you did. And I mean, we're really talking about the wealthiest of the wealthy here. But even so, even if the inheritance was just enough to make it actually, affordable to go to an exclusive school like that, where you're exposed to people who have access to billions of dollars and all the confidence in the world as a result, and do things like, I don't know, start Facebook, and you meet them, and then you become a Facebook billionaire later on by virtue of having been near the kid who started Facebook, or near the kids who almost started Facebook, the Winklevoss twins, right, who just showed up with money and then graduated and then used their money and connections to make more money for themselves. Is that any less a sweetheart deal or trading off of your dad's name? Not really. But, I'm sure they don't believe it that way. They don't see it that way. But it kind of is. And so what? But we love it in this country. Unless, of course, there's public office involved. Which does change the equation somewhat. Because, of course, all the power and influence is just supposed to be on loan to you. Not, your permanent property to turn into financial advantage later on. However, on the other hand, as long as you're not doing while you're in office, maybe it's certainly no different than inheriting other things in terms of the weirdness of it. And I'm not certain why, but, the knowledge we gave you, the on-the-job training that came with being president, though you may never, I hope, have traded on the job while you were in it, afterwards, you certainly do. You come away with experience that can't be returned to the American people in their custody, right? So can you leverage that and turn it into something? Yeah, you can. Sometimes it's, real leverage inside the government with the successor administration. Sometimes it's just know-how. Sometimes it's just star power and nothing else. But, that's another thing we love in this country. Celebrity. Nothing more valuable than that. So anyway, I just thought that was an interesting departure point from what Adam Davidson was talking about, which, more to the point with respect to Philip Bump's article was, it's true. We tried very hard to create a both sides story out of it, but not only did it turn out that the two stories just didn't compare in terms of impact. Burisma was just not, for Hunter Biden or anyone else, the vehicle for corruption and personal wealth accumulation that the Trump organization was. And the wrongdoing, if any, was not nearly as clear as it was for the Trump organization and what they were doing. And on top of all that, they couldn't even put their finger on exactly what was wrong, other than kind of being lame, and really what did Hunter Biden know, or what was he able to do that other people couldn't do if they didn't have a famous or influential father. And the answer might have been nothing. But on the other hand, I do know a lot of people, and all of us know a lot of people whose parents might be brilliant or influential or rich or all three, and the kids are not worth much. But, they make a pretty good living anyway. Sometimes we do feel like it's an entitlement, even if it's just small bore stuff. You don't have to be the heir to the Trump organization. You could be the heir to a plumbing supply business, and the dim kid who barely can, figure his way out of a paper bag. But what the hell? We'll make him in charge of the plumbing supply business, and let him make his living off of it after Dad passes on. And as long as he doesn't, totally destroy the place or steal all the money, it'll be a good living, an undeserved living perhaps, but a good one, and it'll pay for a nice house and maybe even a country club membership, and who knows, a boat, nice cars, etc. Even though he never really did get the hang of the plumbing supply business. But so long as he didn't steal all the money and hurt anybody, what the hell, right? But, bump it up to the billionaire level, and there's no escaping the wrongdoing. Not for Trump organization anyway, because that whole thing was built on wrongdoing from the ground up. They were never going to take that legit. It was simply impossible. All right. Anyway, I just thought that was an interesting addition to what Philip Bump had to say. Good weekend conversation. Although, if this turns out to be your weekend conversation, I don't know, man. Get another hobby, I guess. I'm sorry to have done this to you. Have a good weekend doing something else. Maybe you could forget all of this garbage. Maybe I can poke around just a little bit more in Pocket and come up with something, I don't know, maybe a little more cheery or a little more current, anyway, for you to waste your weekend on. Either that or we just have to expand the show to weekends and have a little less socializing time for you. I mean, you'll be well informed, but we just don't want you to get out into society that often. All right, let's see what comes next. So while we are following up on older stories and stories we didn't circle back to yet, I thought I would add this one. Maybe we'll fit it in before the next break. Do you remember when we turned our attention to Londongrad and the idea that so many of the Russian oligarchs had landed there and were laundering their money there, and then sort of ingratiating and integrating themselves into the local politics there. And we mentioned Lord Lebedev. Do you remember this guy? Who essentially had, with his money, supported Boris Johnson for office, and then therefore bought himself a life peerage and a seat in the House of Lords there, actual member of the British government there. And we thought it was really weird, but, we hadn't have anything to sort of really put our finger on here for why it was strange exactly. But Business Insider has a piece that's been sitting in pocket for some time, since February 21st, which I thought I would share with you on this Friday. Lord Lebedev's peerage under spotlight after his lack of contribution to Parliament since maiden speech. You might wonder, what does someone who buys a seat in Parliament like that, like literally actually buys it, which they've had a history of in the UK. It's not a super powerful position to be in. One member of the House of Lords, which is the lesser house now anyway. But at any rate, what you might say, well, maybe he has some extraordinary contribution to make to public life in Britain. He's certainly interested in politics and certainly interested in giving away his money to back politicians. Is there anything going on here? Well, maybe not, according to this story. Boris Johnson's decision to give Evgeny Lebedev a peerage is facing renewed criticism after Insider uncovered the minimal contribution he has made to Parliament since joining the House of Lords. The Russian-born crossbench peer, and I think we found out a little bit about what that meant to be a crossbencher, just basically sort of non-aligned in terms of party affiliation is basically what it comes down to. But where'd we leave off? Oh, yes, right. The Russian-born crossbench peer who was made Baron Lebedev of Hampton and Siberia in November of 2020 made no written or spoken contributions other than his maiden speech in May of 2021. He has not voted at all, which I guess maybe is a good thing. Like maybe he shouldn't be voting, given that he had just basically purchased his seat. But, then you might wonder, well, what do you have it for anyway? It's not doing any good to anybody, so why not get rid of it? Insider also established that Lebedev has only attended the House of Lords 3 times, on December 17th, 2020, May 12th, 2021, and November 24th, 2021. And it may be that most of these lords don't attend at all either. But anyway, that means the owner of the Independent and Evening Standard has narrowly missed the 6-month trigger point for automatic suspension as a member. In other words, they'll kick you out if you only show up, or if you don't show up often enough. And he has shown up only just often enough to avoid getting kicked out. One member of the House of Lords, who was granted anonymity to speak frankly, as were other sources in this article, said Lord Lebedev has made a very good maiden speech. Since then, he hasn't been seen again. He added, it's a status symbol. If Lebedev came and did a day's work, he would gain everybody's respect. Several conservative figures told Insider they had reservations about Lebedev's peerage, which was controversial at the time it was announced. Two sources noted that it had been flagged by the House of Lords Appointments Commission, HOLAC, HOLAC. How do you like that? They have their own acronym. At the time, because his father, Alexander Lebedev, had been a KGB spy. That seems kind of weird. HOLAC, if that's what they actually call it, cannot block appointments, though, and Johnson ultimately overruled their advice. Its members have called on Johnson to examine Russian influence in the House of Lords, something highlighted by Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee in its Russia report, The Guardian reported in 2020. Both HOLAC and the Committee on Standards in Public Life have a long-standing request to make peerage application letters from party leaders public. So far, this has not been approved. Lebedev is not a conservative donor, though. However, he and Johnson have links that go back more than a decade to when the Prime Minister was Mayor of London and Lebedev was proprietor of The Standard, London's biggest city newspaper. So it was a mistake then to say that he was using his money to back Johnson's election, but he is putting money in politics, and his money is in the newspapers as well. One Conservative MP, a former cabinet minister, said, "It brings the whole thing into disrepute." Oh my. Another senior Tory MP said, "The appointment raises questions about the commitment of Johnson's administration to defending the UK against foreign influence." A third Conservative source said, "It is just the whole in-your-faceness of it, the great emblem of just how owned the Conservative Party has become."
Sup fam, it's your boy Darwin, aka Darwin_Darko, aka the most reasonable man in America, aka KITM's senior black correspondent. You might remember me from such recordings as Spacemen vs. Space Cadets and We Need to Talk About Joe Biden. Today, I want to bring you good news about that thing you've been struggling with. Do you suffer from giving too much of a damn? Do you turn on the series of tubes and find yourself outraged at the particular way some news organization strung some sentences together only to realize, nope, this is not some fictional hellscape? Well, guess what? You no longer have to accept the life of giving too much of a damn. You can do something about it, because even you, yes you, can be a show contributor. Now I know what you're thinking. Hey, Mr. Most Reasonable Man in America, I'm not some professional podcast talking guy. Don't worry about it. Do you have a smartphone or some other electronic recording device? Well, that's all you need. You too can have a segment where you can read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Fair warning though, side effects may include general punditry, having opinions and hot takes, getting stuff off your chest, and hearing your own voice. If your recording lasts longer than 5 to 7 minutes, please consult kagrox@gmail.com. That's KAGROX@gmail.com.
Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Edwards Radio. I think I was going to be done with the Business Insider article. There's a little bit left to it, but there actually is at least one or two more nuggets that I thought were of some interest. The first I'm going to skip over and come back to it. The second one was a good setup for it. A Lord Newby, and he is designated here as Lord parentheses Dick Newby. I don't really know why they do it that way. There's two Lord Newbys, I guess. Lord Dick Newby, a member of the Upper House's Procedure and Privileges Committee, told Insider, this is important background, every peer has a duty to participate in the work of the Lords if they are, we think of that as being a different thing here in the United States. The work of the Lord, singular, but okay. The work of the House of Lords, they're talking about. If they are unwilling or unable to do so, they should take a leave of absence or retire. And maybe that's the better of the options here. But this is the really important or interesting point. Good point here. Liam Byrne, a Labour MP and member of the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, said, as the son of a KGB colonel, like maybe there's something good about this, right? Like not just to be suspicious, but as the son of a KGB colonel, one would have thought Lord Lebedev would be full to the brim with insights to offer as we debate the nation's Russia policy. Instead, his silence appears almost deafening, right? He could perhaps give his adoptive new homeland a real edge in formulating its Russia policy, but he has not done that. He has stayed away rather than contribute what he might actually know about the inner workings of Russian intelligence services to the policymakers there in the UK. That seems like a major shortcoming and the sort of thing that would make you say once and for all that you really just have no business being in a governmental role, period. And I'm sorry, and find something else to do for a hobby. Anyway, just sort of interesting. Thought I would add that. Shifting gears to other stuff, we might end perhaps today with a double header of Amanda Marcotte pieces. There's two interesting ones here vying for my attention, also from several weeks ago. This is a great catch-up day. There's one that she was tweeting about by saying back on, March 9th, I frequently argue that Republicans don't actually believe the big lie, but just assert it as a cover story for their true desire to end democracy. Every time I get pushback from people who desperately want to believe that Trumpers are morons instead of fascists. And equally of interest, a earlier piece from March 4th. It was a big week for her then. And this I know to, I think, make some really interesting points. But let's see if we can't fit them both in. The second piece, if I do this, what do I have to lose? New documents show Trump feared no consequences for a coup. We always knew that was likely the case. But let's see. We'll start with the first one, which was the second in time to be published. Or is it? No, maybe not. Maybe, she was tweeting about it on March 9th, but then reaches back for an old article about it from January of this year. Republican voters don't actually believe the big lie about January 6th. They're in on the con, as she puts it. Of the 725 people arrested so far for the January 6th insurrection incited by Donald Trump, perhaps one of the most telling stories is that of the very first person sentenced, Anna Morgan Lloyd. On Facebook, Morgan Lloyd's attitude about participating in a violent attempt to overthrow democracy was jubilant, declaring it the best day ever. Oh, I remember that one. But when faced with the possibility of prison time, she masterfully escaped punishment by pretending to be reformed. After talking up all of the studying she did in jail about the importance of democracy and the evils of fascism, she even claimed to have watched Schindler's List. Morgan Lloyd turned on the waterworks. The act worked. Morgan Lloyd was let off with a slap on the wrist. There were some embedded tweets here from Zoe Tillman, who I guess had been watching the proceedings, and who said Morgan Lloyd appears to tear up and wipes her eyes as Shaner, whoever that is, describes her reaction to reading Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy. Shaner said that Morgan Lloyd called to ask, is it really that bad? And Shaner replied, yep, and sometimes a lot worse. Morgan Lloyd continuing to cry, I would just like to apologize to the court, the American people, my family. I went there to support and show support for President Trump, and I'm ashamed that it became a savage display of violence that day. Well, as Amanda says, the act worked. Morgan Lloyd was let off with a slap on the wrist, getting probation with no prison time. The judge seemed to sincerely believe her tale of being fooled into fascism and finding redemption through the magic of learning. This is why he was furious later to learn that Morgan Lloyd's gut-wrenching show of remorse was all nonsense. Indeed, it was only a day after she was handed her light sentence that Morgan Lloyd was telling lies on Fox News, saying, we see nobody damage anything, and the rioters were actually very polite. In reality, the rioters did $1.5 million in damage, injured nearly 140 police officers, and were so out of control that 5 people died on the scene. Many of the officers who defended the Capitol from the violent mob are still paying the price 1 year later. 6 months after the insurrection, 17 were still on leave due to injuries. 4 have committed suicide in the past year. As Officer Michael Fanone testified about that day, I'm sure I was screaming, but I don't think I could even hear my own voice. So, was Morgan Lloyd just delusional? Did she not have eyes in her head? Was she unable to see the violence plainly visible in the overwhelming amount of video and photographic evidence of the day? No, of course not. As the judge who sentenced her later noted when issuing a harsher sentence to another rioter, hopes that her contrition were real were quickly dashed. The lesson here is clear and should remain clear. Fascists lie. That is the nature of authoritarian ideology, which doesn't value good faith discourse in a democracy. And by the way, I'll also add here the fact that she didn't wait long enough for other of her co-defendants, I guess you could call them, but other people arrested and on trial for the riot to get their lighter sentences and be able to pull the same trick also shows you they have no interest in supporting their fellow fascists either. They're entirely gimmitarian. They got the light sentence, and then the rest of you can go to hell. Fascists lie, though, right? That is the nature of the authoritarian ideology, which doesn't value good faith discourse in a democracy. Indeed, they spit on democracy. Or, as rioters in the Capitol reportedly did, they crap on it. But, she used the real word for it. All that the fascists respect is power and domination. Lying, if anything, is valorized in the authoritarian ideology because lying is an expression of power. Ready for this? Why that is? To lie to someone else, a judge, a journalist, randos on social media, is a display of dominance over them and contempt for their petty attachment to Enlightenment values. That bad faith is the lingua franca of fascism, and that is not a new observation. Jean-Paul Sartre famously noted that fascists see lying as a delicious troll, for it is their adversary, or adversary, he might have said adversary, who is obliged to use words responsibly, since he believes in words. All of which is why it's important not to take it at face value when Republicans claim to believe various lies around Trump's attempted coup, from the claim that the election was stolen to the justifications rolled out for the rioters' behavior that day. None of it. Unfortunately, the word believe still gets attached to the various nonsense Republican voters spout about the attempted coup. Republicans who watch Fox News are more likely to believe false theories about January 6th, blared a Washington Post headline on a Monday morning analysis of new polling about what Americans say about the insurrection. What makes someone think that the 2020 election was stolen, writes Philip Bump in the opening paragraph. It's important to note, however, that there's good reason to believe that Republicans do not actually believe the election was stolen, nor should one assume that they are legitimately deluded when they tell pollsters lies like Trump didn't incite it, or it was Antifa, or the protesters were peaceful, or the attack was justified. As Heather Digby Parton noted on Monday, 78% of Republicans now believe that Trump bears only a little or no responsibility for the attack, which is contradictory since they also profess to believe that the mob was protecting democracy. These contradictions between professed beliefs reflect the contradictory lies that are flowing from Fox News. Tucker Carlson, the most adamant rewriter of the coup's history, switches seamlessly between denying that the riot was an insurrection, claiming that the insurrection was a false flag orchestrated by the FBI and Antifa, and claiming that the insurrectionists were justified. That each of these claims contradicts the other is of no matter because Carlson believes none of it, and neither do his viewers. They are engaged in a collective act of dissembling and gaslighting, deliberately filling the discourse with noise so they never have to actually defend what their true beliefs about the insurrection actually are. So, what is that true belief? Hard to say exactly under all that noise, but the likeliest one is that democracy is a threat to white supremacy, therefore democracy must be ended. This deeper, more unspeakable belief peeks out occasionally. We see it when Carlson claims that opposition to Trump's attempted coup and the insurrection is an attack on, quote, legacy Americans, his latest clunky euphemism for the conservative white people he believes should be treated as the only legitimate Americans. As Media Matters documented at the end of December, Fox News and Carlson especially spent the bulk of 2021 hyping the neo-Nazi Great Replacement theory. The theory starts from the assumption that white conservatives are entitled to be the dominant class in the U.S. From there, demographic changes are recast as a giant conspiracy against white people. The neo-Nazis explicitly say Jews are conspiring to replace white Christians with people of color that they supposedly can control. The Fox News crew euphemizes that by saying it's the elites or the globalists. Either way, the same conspiracy theory bounces around the right-wing media ecosphere and creates a permission structure for conservative whites to treat racial diversity as an act of deliberate aggression, and hence the hatred, I think, for CRT, which they believe they conflate intentionally with racial diversity and sensitivity training. Anyway, it's used to justify their embrace of fascism and violence as an act of self-defense. It's the same game Nazis played by accusing Jews of secret conspiracies, and it's for the same general purpose. That's why it's so critical to abandon the hope that Republicans are merely delusional when they parrot the big lie. As the judge who sentenced Anna Morgan Lloyd learned to his regret, authoritarians will say whatever they feel they need to in order to evade accountability, whether consequences come in the form of a prison sentence or merely having someone point out that they are racist. Fascists lie, especially to pollsters, who are viewed as part of the elite class of pro-democracy forces that they are trying to destroy. Seeing them for who they are is the first step of fighting back effectively. Let me follow that up with this other piece that I mentioned from Amanda, published on March 4th of this year, and a little bit more up to date. If I do this, what do I have to lose? It's a quote, I guess, from the former guy. New documents show Trump feared no consequences for a coup. New court filings from the January 6th committee demonstrate Trump thought he'd get away with his crimes. And I don't think we really needed the filing to know that. But you probably recall that early March tranche of filings that were made. This was the point during which the committee essentially had to protest that John Eastman's claim of executive privilege might be trumped by the crime fraud exception, and that was the first, I think, information that, or the first indication that the committee thought that obviously a crime had been committed here. We always figured that a lot of them felt that way, but that was the first written word of it anyway, that it got included in filings to a court, which, presumably means you're not kidding. Anyway, this was another interesting distillation from that, not one that I saw much other attention given to. There is one simple reason why Donald Trump orchestrated his coup, one which led to a violent insurrection on January 6, 2021. He didn't think he'd ever face consequences for doing so. A document filed by the January 6th committee with a California federal court on Wednesday confirmed it. The document is filed on a narrow question about obtaining documents from likely Trump co-conspirator John Eastman, who is claiming attorney-client privilege, but that privilege doesn't give lawyers the right to conspire to commit crimes with their clients, which is exactly what the committee alleges Eastman and Trump were doing. The Select Committee also has a good faith basis for concluding that the president and members of his campaign engaged in a criminal conspiracy to defraud the United States. Late Thursday, that a quote from the filing, of course, late Thursday, the New York Times published an analysis of the evidence for this claim presented in the filing, and unsurprisingly, it's damning and extensive. Through multiple witnesses and documents, the Times shows that Trump was repeatedly informed that his election loss was real. It also shows that Trump's claims of, quote, fraud were based on nothing. When advisors shot down his conspiracy theories, he just kept making up new ones. This much we figured, right? This is not the behavior, of course, of someone who has a sincere reason to believe that an election was fraudulent. This is a person perpetuating a lie and trying to falsify evidence to support it. But the most chilling detail of the New York Times breakdown is what former Justice Department official Richard Donahue described as Trump's rationale for attempting to overthrow democracy. Not so much as, it's a bad system of government, or I could do better, or the country needs me. It was this. I added that part. It was, the president said something to the effect of, what do I have to lose? Right? If I do this, what do I have to lose? Donahue told the committee, Trump asked. Donahue further says he pleaded with Trump not to hurt the country, quote unquote, hurt the country. But of course, that plea fell on deaf ears. Trump is a sociopathic narcissist. Of course, he wasn't going to be affected by appeals to the greater good or feel compelled by his own oath to uphold democracy. Trump cares about one thing and one thing only. Always has and always will, Donald J. Trump. And sometimes Donald Trump's penis, I guess, is probably, a separate entity that he cares about. At this late date, Anyone who denies this is a liar or delusional to the point of madness. What matters here, however, is the deep assurance Trump had that he would never face a real consequence, neither politically nor legally, and certainly not criminally, for perpetuating a massive crime against democracy. And why shouldn't he think that? Trump has been criming his entire life and never faced anything like a serious consequence. As the New York Times has repeatedly shown in its reporting, Trump has been a massive tax fraud his whole career. He doesn't even bother to deny it. He brags about how defrauding the government and other taxpayers is a sport and makes him smart. He's been accused of sexual harassment, assault, and rape by over 24 women. But we don't have just their testimony to rely on to believe him, because Trump himself bragged about it in the infamous grab him by the pussy tape. Even when one of his illegal schemes comes back to bite him, as happened when he was forced to settle out of court with defrauded customers of his Trump University grift, the consequences are insufficient to actually be felt. Hell, he's even managed to get the Republican National Committee to pay his legal bills so that he can keep wasting his money, on golf courses. It's not just that Trump commits crimes because he knows he'll get away with them. I'd argue that getting away with it is a big part of what motivates him to commit crimes. It's the thrill of getting one over on everyone else. It's the feeling of power it gives him, realizing that he can get away with stuff anyone else would go to jail for. He doesn't even hide that, as all the bragging about tax fraud and sexual assault shows. And he will not stop committing crimes, including reattempting a coup, unless someone actually stops him. Or cholesterol does, or falling down the stairs does, or COVID finally does. As the New York Times, okay, I added that part. Don't blame Amanda for that. But he should drop dead. Thank you. As the New York Times analysis shows, one of the biggest obstacles in prosecuting Trump will be the question of his state of mind at the time. Obviously, Trump knew full well that he lost the election and his crimes otherwise are just the latest in a lifetime of lying, but he also has the instinct of self-preservation that flows from a lifelong habit of committing crimes. It appears he was careful never to tip his hand to the fact that he knew he was lying to anyone who could be a criminal witness against him. Instead, he would just keep reiterating his claim that the election was a fraud and expect the person he was badgering to pick up on his underlying wish, which was for someone to falsify the evidence to support his lies. It's the same strategy Trump used in trying to extort is what she writes, but extort is the right word, exhort Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky into faking evidence to smear Joe Biden in the 2020 campaign. He never directly asked Zelensky to counterfeit evidence, but instead says, "I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation." Similarly, when Trump pressured Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to falsify votes, he never directly demands it. Instead, he asked Raffensperger to find the votes. The meaning of the ask is clear, but Trump always carefully uses language that lawyers can later use to quibble over his intent. As law professor Alan Rosenstein told the New York Times, a finder of fact could conclude that Trump is so uniquely narcissistic and self-absorbed that he actually thought the election had been stolen, which was no doubt the defense Trump had in mind when he carefully made sure to talk in that sideways way he loves to use when engaging in one of his many conspiracies and frauds. I think my dad actually, I don't know whether he buys whether or not Trump believes it, but he definitely believes that a jury would buy the possibility that he could believe it. And that's why he's actually thinking, it'll be a danger to prosecute Trump because the jury won't convict him and then he'll get off and then he'll say, see, I'm vindicated. But you know what? I think there's no greater danger from that than anything else because it doesn't matter what happens. He'll continue to say he's vindicated. He could get convicted. He'll say he's been vindicated. But at least if he's convicted, we can lock him up. Anyway. We know from context that lying and not delusion is the explanation for Trump's claims of a stolen election. Trump was claiming that the election was rigged for months before the election even happened. That is not the behavior of a man who saw evidence of fraud and is raising the alarm. That's the behavior of a man who plans to commit fraud and is laying the groundwork for his lies. In February, Trump let the mask slip a little by releasing a statement asserting that his former vice president, Mike Pence, did have the right to change the outcome. That is, notice the end there, right? Of course, another lie, but in lying about the law, he let slip the truth about his state of mind when he revealed that he intended to, quote, change the outcome. His lawyers likely panicked because Trump released another statement insisting what he meant was that Pence could send back the votes for recertification or approval or whatever the hell he comes up with, right? But no one of good faith believes this. He just got out over his skis in his dashed off statement, and the truth about his intent slipped out, which thankfully the January 6th committee is seizing on. Still, Trump is a slippery mofo who has a lifetime of experience getting away with crime. That is likely fueling what increasingly looks like a troubling reluctance on the part of Attorney General Merrick Garland to actually prosecute Trump. If so, that is a massive mistake. It's abundantly clear nothing will stop Trump but a threat of consequences or death or violence. I don't know, but she didn't include those things. But nothing will stop Trump but a threat of consequences, one that has teeth. He is not constrained by morality. He has none. He is not constrained by the Republican Party, which has made clear they will assist Trump in his anti-democratic efforts and cover up for any crimes he commits along the way. It may be hard to prosecute him, but it is literally the only hope we have of stopping him from attempting another coup, besides death. With the full support of the GOP behind him next time he tries to overthrow democracy, he'll likely succeed. What do I have to lose is basically Trump's motto. If he never gets an answer, he will never stop. Thank you, Amanda. I appreciate it. Well put. All right, one more story that I think we can squeeze in. I had a different direction in mind. I was going to read you something else on the same subject, but instead I'll bring you up to speed on something I've recorded later than the rest of this stuff, but would have been new news to share with you on Friday, which it is as far as you're concerned. This quick story. Donald Trump sues Hillary Clinton and allies over Russia claims. That's the headline that they're using for this story over at Politico. The Hill also had a report. Trump sues Hillary Clinton and DNC over Russian collusion allegations. Okay. You get some picture of what's going on here? What a nut. All right. Here's the Politico story on it. Josh Gerstein and Kyle Cheney on the piece. Former President Donald Trump is suing 2016 Democratic presidential nominee Hillary Clinton in what is correctly termed here a sprawling case that accuses her of conspiring with dozens of other actors, frequent targets of Trump's conspiracy theories and rage, to topple his presidency. The new lawsuit, filed Thursday in federal court in Fort Pierce, Florida, accuses Clinton, her campaign, various campaign aides, former FBI Director James Comey, the Democratic National Committee, and others of racketeering conspiracy for allegedly joining in, quote, an unthinkable plot. Unthinkable. To falsely accuse him of colluding with Russia in the 2016 presidential elections. Yes, having lost 60 lawsuits relitigating the 2020 election and ruining the world and democracy along the way, he now wants to relitigate the 2016 election, which he says he actually won. Of course, he says he won the 2020 one as well. Anyway, in the run-up to the 2016 presidential election, Hillary Clinton and her cohorts orchestrated an unthinkable plot, one that shocks the conscience and is an affront to this nation's democracy, the complaint says. And shocks the conscience, by the way, is like legal magic words that create liability almost all by themselves, but no point in going into that. Just they didn't come up with that phrase. It has specific meaning in law, so they figured they'd throw it in and see if they can get some relief. Acting in concert, the defendants maliciously conspired to weave a false narrative that their Republican opponent, Donald J. Trump, was colluding with a hostile foreign sovereignty. The suit accused the defendants of obstruction of justice and theft of trade secrets. That's the one. That's a good one, all right. As well as unlawful hacking into Trump's private communications. Well, it's a projection suit. The actions taken in furtherance of their scheme, falsifying evidence, deceiving law enforcement, and exploiting access to highly sensitive data sources are so outrageous, subversive, and incendiary that even the events of Watergate pale in comparison, the complaint adds. They don't pale in comparison necessarily to, say, the insurrection and attacking the Capitol, but hey. The sprawling 108-page complaint reads like a greatest hits of Trump's long-held grievances against the public figures most closely associated with the investigation of his campaign's ties to Russia in 2016. It stitches together disparate details unearthed in the ongoing investigation by Special Counsel John Durham, if you thought we were rid of him, as well as long-known details about the FBI's Russia probe and Special Counsel Robert Mueller's subsequent investigation. The suit appears to seek more than $72 million in damages, which the complaint says is the tally of legal fees and other costs of defending against the alleged untruths. Boy, wait till they get on the hook for losing their suit and paying Hillary's legal fees. In another court filing in the case, Trump's attorneys asked for only $21 million. So, we'll see how that one works out. The suit was filed by Alina Habba, H-A-B-B-A, a Bedminster, New Jersey-based attorney that Trump tapped last year after dismissing other more prominent lawyers who had been handling much of the wide range of litigation he faces in various courts. A Deerfield Beach, Florida-based lawyer, Peter Tickton, is serving as the lead local counsel because they filed down in Florida, where he lives now. In the public docket for the case, Trump's attorneys included the home addresses of the vast majority of the defendants in the suit. For Trump, however, they listed the address of Tickton's law firm, even though I think we all know where Mar-a-Lago is, and you could probably find it on Google Maps. Anyway, very interesting. Time now for us to wrap things up and hand the microphone over to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Let's all sue Justice, too, while we're at it.
From
Why not?
networksradio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
All right, I changed my mind. Do not sue Justice. It would be totally unfair. Anyway, we'll be back on Monday live. All of you can report in on your backpedaling out of the lawsuits you're ready to file against them. It totally doesn't deserve it. Let's all listen instead of suing them. But what the hell? The world's gone crazy. See you next week.